At my wife's funeral, the gravedigger pulled me aside. "Sir, your wife paid me to bury an empty coffin." I thought he was crazy. Stop joking. He secretly slipped an old brass key into my hand and whispered, "Don't go home. Go to Unit 24. Right now." Inside Unit 24, I found something that left me frozen. And in that moment, I knew I had to save my own life before it completely collapsed. Welcome to this story. Before we open the door to Unit 24, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from. One quick note: this is a fictional story, and some details are dramatized to make the narrative more engaging and meaningful. The gravedigger's hand clamped onto my bicep like a rusted vice, just as I turned to leave my wife's side for the last time. It was an abrupt, jarring physical intrusion that felt like a sacrilege against the silence of Oakland Cemetery. I am Brooks Sterling, a 68-year-old retired bridge inspector, with a gaze as steady as the steel beams I once surveyed. But in that moment, I felt my internal pillars beginning to buckle. I stood alone as the red Georgia clay was shoveled onto the mahogany casket that supposedly held Alara, my wife of 40 years. The air was thick enough to chew a humid Atlanta afternoon, heavy with the cloying scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh, wet earth. Every thud of the shovel against the wood resonated in my teeth, a rhythmic reminder of a structural failure I couldn't fix. The crowd of mourners had already begun to drift toward the line of black town cars, leaving me to face the red mound and the man who wouldn't let go of my arm. Leander Finch, 58, a cemetery groundskeeper whose skin was tanned to leather by the Georgia sun, intercepted me as the crowd began to thin. He looked frantic, his eyes darting toward the retreating figures of my daughter Juniper and her husband Garrett. He leaned in close, bringing with him the pungent smell of cheap tobacco and damp subterranean earth. His grip tightened, pulling me slightly away from the path. "Sir, do not walk away." He whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over granite. "Not yet. I have a contract, 20 years in the waiting. Have you ever felt the world tilt on its axis while your feet stayed firmly on the ground?" I looked at his weathered face, trying to find the spark of madness that would explain this interruption. But all I saw was a terrifying bureaucratic certainty. The humid air seemed to freeze in my lungs. My mind, trained to look for fractures and stress points, couldn't find a logical explanation for why a groundskeeper would be citing a 2-decade-old contract at my wife's graveside. I tried to pull back, but Finch was surprisingly strong, his leathered hands holding me in place like an anchor. He fumbled in the pocket of his stained overalls and pulled out a small object. "Sir, your wife paid me a very large sum of money a long time ago for a specific service," he said, his breath hot against my ear. She was very clear about the timing. Empty. The word hit me harder than the grief ever could, though he hadn't even spoken it yet. He pressed a small, cold brass key into my palm, the metal biting into my skin. It was labeled with a simple stamped number, 24. Before I could demand an explanation or shout for Garrett to come back, Finch's eyes went wide with a sudden localized panic. He let go of my arm and retreated toward the shadows of a nearby granite mausoleum, disappearing into the dark, like a ghost returning to the stone. "Sir, that box is empty," he threw back over his shoulder in a final hushed hiss. "Your wife paid me to bury air." I stood frozen, the humid breeze suddenly feeling like ice against my neck. I looked down at the small brass key biting into my skin, then back at the mound of fresh dirt that was supposed to hold my wife, and realized my entire life had just become a structural lie. A heavy, warm palm landed on my shoulder, nearly making me drop the brass key into the very mud I had just learned was a lie. I flinched, my fingers tightening around the cold metal as I forced my hand deep into my trousers pocket. The weight of it pressed against my thigh like a brand, a physical secret I wasn't prepared to share. Garrett Kendrick, 34, a sharply dressed mergers and acquisitions director, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. his eyes showing a grief that looked disturbingly real. He smelled of an expensive woodsy cologne that seemed out of place among the scent of wet red clay and wilting lilies. "Brooks," he said, his voice dropping to that practiced, somber pitch used by men who negotiate for a living. "You have been standing here a long time. It is over now." He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture that should have felt like a lifeline, but instead felt like the slow closing of a trap. I looked at the sharp crease of his charcoal suit, and then up at his face. For years I had seen him as the perfect partner for my daughter, a man of ambition and stability. Now, with Finch's hissed warning still ringing in my ears, I searched for a crack in the facade. His eyes were dark and wet with tears, yet they didn't quite settle. They scanned the perimeter of the cemetery with a restless, predatory efficiency. "I am here for you, Pop." He continued, using the familiar nickname that usually warmed me. "Always have been." I felt a prickle of sweat break out on the back of my neck despite the humidity. It was a structural warning, the kind I used to feel when inspecting a suspension cable that looked fine on the surface but was rotting from the core. In my world, a bridge doesn't fall all at once. It groans and snaps one rusted bolt at a time until the foundation simply vanishes. Garrett's shoes crunched on the gravel as he shifted his weight, and I realized he wasn't just comforting me. He was guarding the grave. He was ensuring I didn't linger long enough to ask the wrong questions. "We should get Juniper to the car," he said, nodding toward my daughter. Juniper Sterling, 29, a pediatric cardiologist whose hands were trained for the most delicate surgeries, clutched a damp tissue as she watched the funeral service end. She looked shattered, a fragile glass sculpture in a black dress. "She is very delicate today," Garrett whispered. "We need to get her home." "Is something wrong, Brooks? You are looking at me like I am a stranger." I forced a stiff smile, a lie that felt heavy in my mouth. "I just need a moment with her. Alone." "I will catch up in a minute," I replied. He hesitated, his gaze sharpening for a fleeting second before the mask of the grieving son-in-law slid back into place. How many times had I welcomed this wolf into my home, unaware that he was already counting the silver? "Don't take too long." Garrett said, his voice smooth as silk. "The house feels too big without Alara." I watched him walk away, the dull thud of an SUV door closing echoing through the quiet graveyard. As Garrett led my daughter away, his hand rested on the small of her back in a way that suddenly looked less like support and more like an arrest. I stood by the empty mound, the brass key burning in my pocket, knowing I couldn't follow them back to a house built on sand. I had to follow the truth. I waited until the engine noise faded into the hum of the Atlanta afternoon before I scrambled into my truck and locked the doors, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the steering wheel for a full minute, watching the heat waves shimmer over the cemetery road where Garrett's SUV had just disappeared. The metallic taste of fear was sharp in my mouth, coiling around the growing suspicion that my son-in-law was far more than just a grieving husband. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key, its cold surface a stark contrast to the stifling, stale air trapped inside the cabin. Just as I went to reach for the yellowed envelope Finch had pressed upon me, my phone vibrated in the cup holder with a sharp, insistent buzz. It was a text from Juniper. The message read, "Dad, come home alone. Need to talk. Just you." I froze, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in the windshield like a warning light. In 29 years, my daughter had never called me Dad. To her, I was always Daddy or Papa, even after she became a high-ranking surgeon who spent her days repairing broken hearts. This cold, clinical three-letter word was a linguistic fracture that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a plea from my daughter. It was a lure, a leash pulled tight by whoever was holding her phone. Garrett was fishing, and I was the intended catch. Believe me when I say that a man's world doesn't end with a bang. It ends with a three-letter word on a glowing screen. My blood turned to ice as the strategic implications of that text settled over me. If he was controlling her phone, he was controlling her. I finally tore open the envelope, the smell of old parchment and hidden years wafting into the hot truck. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Ilara's elegant sloping handwriting. Seeing her script was like hearing a voice from across a canyon. Brooks, if you are reading this, then my death was the only move left on the board. It began. The ink seemed to pulse under my thumb. The letter was a confession and a warning. Ilara had spent months investigating Garrett, discovering he was a high-level mole for the Covenant, a criminal empire she thought she had dismantled decades ago when she was still active with the Bureau. She had faked her own death, staging the heart attack and the empty burial to draw the wolves out of the brush and protect me from the crossfire. The enemy isn't at the gate, she wrote. He is sitting at our dinner table. She wasn't in that grave. She was waiting for me. The letter provided a final coordinate, Highway 85 Storage Complex Unit 24. I read the lines 3 times, my vision blurring. Every instinct I possessed as an inspector told me the family home was now a structural trap, a site of imminent collapse. I couldn't go back to the suburbs. I had to follow the key Ilara had left me. I threw the truck into gear, the engine roaring to life and drowning out the silence of the dead behind me. My eyes blurred with tears of rage and a desperate surging hope, knowing that every mile I drove toward the storage complex was a mile I was leaving my daughter alone with a monster. I pulled out of Oakland Cemetery, leaving the sandbags and the red clay behind, driving toward the only truth I had left. The rhythmic thud of tires on the expansion joints of Highway 85 felt like a heavy industrial heartbeat against the soles of my feet. Memories are like structural stress fractures. You don't notice the damage until the entire bridge starts to scream under the weight of the truth. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white and aching, while the flickering light of the dashboard cast long, jittery shadows against my face. The rage I felt for Garrett was a cold, hard knot in my gut. But underneath it, a much older foundation was beginning to crumble. My mind, desperate to find an anchor, drifted back to a rain-slicked night in the spring of 1996. I could almost smell the rain hitting the kitchen window of our old house, that clean, sharp scent that always promised a fresh start. Ilara was sitting at the table, a cup of tea between her hands, the cold steam rising from it in a thin, forgotten ribbon. I remembered the way her hands were shaking, a tremor I had never seen in the woman who once spent hours calmly cataloging rare manuscripts at the university library. Brooks. I didn't spend my days cataloging books, she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter on the glass. I spent them cataloging monsters. The identity reveal had hit me like a physical blow. My quiet, book-loving wife was actually an FBI undercover specialist, the primary architect behind the destruction of a billion-dollar criminal empire called the Covenant. It's over now, she had promised me, looking me in the eye with a terrifying intensity I was only just beginning to understand. The Covenant is dismantled. We're safe. I had built my family on a bed of sand, convinced the concrete I saw on the surface was thick enough to withstand any storm. In that 1996 kitchen, Ilara explained the $1.2 billion empire she helped topple and her decision to quit the Bureau to protect our infant daughter Juniper. I'm choosing us, Brooks, she had said, her voice finally steadying. I'm choosing Juniper. They think I'm just a witness. They'll forget my name in a year. I remembered the relief that had flooded through me then, a warm, naive wave that convinced me the danger had passed. I believed her when she said she was vanishing from the records, effectively erasing her professional history to become the mother our daughter deserved. For nearly 30 years, I cherished that safety, never realizing it was merely a temporary ceasefire in a war I didn't even know was still being fought. How do you look a woman in the eye for 30 years and never see the steel hidden behind the silk? The vibration of the steering wheel intensified as I pushed the truck faster toward Riverdale, the past bleeding into the present, until I could no longer tell where the memories ended and the road began. Every mile I traveled made me realize how little I truly knew about the woman I had just buried. She hadn't just quit the FBI. She had performed a vanishing act so complete, it was a rehearsal for the faked death she had just executed. I snapped back to the present, the hum of the tires on Highway 85 sounding like a countdown, and realized that Alara hadn't been hiding from the past, she had been standing guard against it. The realization left me cold, a solitary traveler on a bridge that had been burning for 30 years without my knowledge. The gravel crunched under my tires like bone, a rhythmic warning that I was crossing a threshold I could never step back over. The massive rusted sign for the Highway 85 storage complex loomed ahead, like a tombstone in the fading Georgia light. I pulled my truck into the desolate, wind-swept lot, feeling the cold weight of the brass key in my pocket pressing against my thigh. This place was a sprawl of industrial rot, smelling of ozone and wet metal, with high-voltage wires humming overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. I expected to find a deserted maze, but instead, I saw a man leaning against a black sedan near the primary gate. He had the predatory yet disciplined posture of someone used to operating in the shadows. He didn't look like a storage clerk. He looked like a threat. "You are late, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the wind. "I didn't realize I was on a schedule," I replied, stepping out of the truck and keeping my hand near my pocket. Thane Garrison, a 52-year-old FBI special agent in charge with a salt and pepper buzz cut, waited at the gate of the Riverdale storage facility, looking more like a hardened contractor than a federal agent. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he flashed a badge with a practiced flick of his wrist. It was a badge I recognized from the subtext of Alara's old stories, the kind issued to men who lived in the black budget world of the Bureau. I realized then that this complex wasn't just a place for old furniture. It was a sanctioned FBI black site that my wife had been utilizing for months right under my nose. A badge, a gun, a lie. It was Alara's trinity. Garrison watched me with a clinical detachment that set my engineer instincts on edge. "She said you would be wearing the tie she gave you for your 30th anniversary. He noted, his gaze lingering on my collar. She was right. I felt a surge of reluctant trust, mixed with a breathless, agonizing anticipation. "Where is she, Garrison?" I demanded, my voice tight with restrained anger. "No more games." He didn't answer immediately. He turned and began walking into the rows of corrugated metal units, the glare of the setting sun bleeding off the steel. "The Covenant has ears everywhere, Brooks," he whispered without looking back. "Keep your voice down and your eyes moving." Walking through these metal aisles felt like walking through the rib cage of a leviathan that had swallowed my life whole. Garrison explained that the facility was under federal contract for sensitive relocations, but the real shock came when he admitted that Alara hadn't just reached out to them recently. "She never truly left their payroll," he said, his boots echoing on the pavement. "She has been a deep-cover consultant for decades." The realization was a cold, physical weight. While I was inspecting bridges and worrying about retirement, my wife was coordinating federal operations from our own zip code. Garrison stopped at a door that looked identical to 100 others, but when he nodded at the padlock of Unit 24, I realized the key in my pocket wasn't just for a room. It was for the truth that would kill the man I used to be. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of dread and hope as I reached for the lock. The key slid into the lock with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent facility. The silence in that corridor didn't feel like peace. It felt like the breath a man takes right before he jumps into an abyss. I stood frozen before the corrugated steel door of Unit 24, my fingers trembling as they gripped the brass. My mind, usually busy analyzing the structural integrity of suspension cables or the load-bearing capacity of reinforced concrete, was struggling to process the monumental weight of the thin metal barrier in front of me. Thane Garrison watched me with a clinical detachment, his silhouette dark against the orange glare of the setting sun at the end of the aisle. His hand rested near his sidearm, his eyes scanning the empty, shadow-drenched rows for any sign that we had been followed. The damp heat of the Georgia evening seemed to pool in this narrow alleyway, smelling of industrial grease and old dust, making every breath I took feel heavy and contested. My hands shouldn't be shaking like this. I whispered more to myself than to him. I've handled high-voltage lines in the middle of a hurricane without a flinch. Garrison didn't look at me, his focus remaining on the perimeter. Different kind of storm, Brooks. Just turn the key. I looked at the brass key, noting the fine scratches and the dull patina that suggested it had been waiting for this exact moment for decades. A secret is like a load-bearing wall. You can't just knock it down without the whole roof caving in on your head. Garrison leaned in closer, his voice a low vibration. He explained that the FBI had been hacking the facility's own security grid for months, looping the camera feeds to mask their presence. They were operating here without the storage company's knowledge, turning this commercial lot into a ghost in the machine. How long has she been in there? I asked, the metallic taste of fear returning to my tongue. Long enough to miss you, Garrison replied, and long enough to know how dangerous this is for both of you. Garrison stepped back, then granting me the solitary space a man needs when he is about to exhume his own life. Have you ever held a piece of metal that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds? That was my key. I remembered the sound of the red clay hitting the mahogany casket just hours ago, and the crushing irony of that performance made my stomach churn. Once you open this, Brooks, the librarian is gone forever, Garrison warned. I know, I said, my voice finally finding its anchor. She's been gone since the cemetery. I was fully aware that my life was about to change forever. But Garrison's final admission added a fresh layer of frost to my blood. He admitted that the Bureau wasn't just protecting Alara. They were using her as the ultimate lure to draw out the Covenant's highest-ranking shadow members. My wife wasn't just a survivor. She was the bait in a federal trap. The lock clicked, a sharp, final sound that severed my past from my future. And as I grabbed the handle to lift the door, I realized I was terrified of who might be standing on the other side. My breath hitched in my chest as the tension reached its breaking point. I heaved the handle upward, ready to face whatever ghost was waiting in the dark. I heaved the rolling door upward, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the hollow facility. The rolling door shrieked against its tracks, a sound of tearing metal that felt like the sky opening up to reveal a ghost. My lungs were burning, and my pulse throbbed in my neck, a rhythmic reminder of the 72 hours I had spent mourning a woman who might not be dead. As the corrugated steel disappeared into the ceiling, I didn't find the dust-covered boxes or mothballed furniture I expected. Instead, I stepped into a high-tech fortress. This wasn't a storage unit. It was a war room. The space inside wasn't a storage unit at all. It was a fully equipped safe house. 3 large monitors lined the left wall, displaying live surveillance feeds. One showed the warehouse near the Chattahoochee River, another our neighborhood in real time, and a third displayed what looked like prison security footage with timestamp codes I didn't recognize. A large tactical map of Atlanta covered the right wall, marked with red pins, connected by string, the Covenant's known locations, safe houses, and operational cells spreading like a cancer across the southeast. File boxes stamped FBI, classified in bold red letters, were stacked beneath a metal desk. The air smelled of fresh coffee and printer ink, as if someone had been working here for weeks, living here, waiting. And then I saw her. A figure rose from behind a bank of monitors silhouetted by the azure glare of the screens. Alara Sterling, 66, was known to the neighborhood as a retired librarian. But inside Unit 24, she stood with the sharp, lethal posture of the undercover agent she had been 30 years ago. She stepped forward, her movements precise and devoid of the soft-shouldered gait I had grown to love. She looked tired, her face etched with new lines of exhaustion, but she was vibrantly, impossibly alive. "Brooks," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the storm of my confusion. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The 3 days I had spent drowning in grief dissolved into a mess of raw, agonizing relief that threatened to snap my knees. You're alive? I choked out my voice, sounding like a stranger's. I touched your hand in that casket, Ilara. You were cold. She wasn't a ghost. She was a soldier. The woman standing before me wasn't the librarian who forgot where she put her glasses. She was a professional who had staged a heart attack with the clinical precision of a chess grandmaster. My knees finally buckled, and she moved with startling speed to catch me, guiding me toward the cold plastic of a folding chair. She explained in a low, steady tone that the body at the viewing had been a cadaver, prepped by a funeral director, who owed the Bureau a debt from a previous life. How do you mourn a woman for 72 hours, only to have her offer you a bottle of water and an apology? I looked at her, searching for a trace of the woman I had lived with, but I realized I was looking at a stranger wearing my wife's face. The grief had to be real, Brooks, she said, her eyes never leaving mine. For Garrett to believe it, your heart had to actually break. He's been watching us for years. I felt a surge of gratitude for her life, but it was quickly being crowded by a dark, jagged resentment. You let me bury a stranger so he could watch me cry, I asked, my voice trembling with a restrained anger. She had prioritized my pain as a tactical asset, a piece of theater, to deceive the man in our house. I looked at her and saw the cold steel of the woman who had dismantled an empire. And for the first time, I was afraid of the truth she was about to tell me. She turned back to the wall of monitors, her fingers flying across a keyboard with a rhythmic clicking that cut through the low hum of the warehouse fans. Ilara didn't just have a hiding spot. She had a shrine to our family's destruction pinned to the corrugated metal with the clinical precision of an autopsy. I stood behind her, the blue light of the screens washing over us, revealing a timeline that made my blood run cold. It started in 2013, a year I remembered for Juniper's 16th birthday and her first car. On the screen, it was marked as the year of acquisition. Ilara pointed to a grainy surveillance photo of our daughter at a college mixer years later. Garrett Kendrick, standing just a few feet away with a calculated, easy smile. He didn't find her by accident. Brooks, Ilara said, her voice devoid of its usual librarian softness. He was assigned to her. Every chance encounter, every shared interest, every favorite song they supposedly discovered together was scripted by a man in a prison cell. I felt a chilling horror settle in my bones as she explained that Garrett had been handpicked by the leader of the Covenant, the same monster Ilara had helped put away decades ago. 28 years ago, I testified against the Covenant. I worked undercover for 18 months, Brooks posing as a bookkeeper for one of their front companies, a shipping firm in Savannah. I saw everything. The wire transfers moving through shell corporations in the Caymans, the drug shipments hidden in legitimate cargo containers, the cold-blooded executions of anyone who asked too many questions. When a 16-year-old dock worker named Marcus stumbled onto a heroin shipment and was killed, for it shot twice in the head and dumped in the river, I knew I had to come forward. My testimony put 12 men behind bars, including the boss. But it also painted a target on my back, on our family, that never really went away. They wanted me dead, Brooks. They still do. He was the ultimate weapon of proxy revenge, a man engineered to be our daughter's perfect match, just so he could eventually tear her heart out from the inside. Lies are like termites. They eat the heart out of your home while you're busy worrying about the paint on the shutters. I had spent 11 years thinking I was a good judge of character, yet I had welcomed a sleeper agent into my home with open arms. Ilara described the training Garrett underwent, a disciple raised from childhood to be the perfect son-in-law while remaining fundamentally loyal to the organization. For 11 years, 3 years of dating, and 8 years of marriage, every "I love you," he whispered to Juniper, was a tactical lie. He's a ghost, Brooks, a man with no soul of his own, only the mission his father gave him. 8 years of marriage, and not a single day of it was real. I looked at a digital photo of our wedding day, seeing Garrett standing between Ilara and me, his arm around Juniper. He wasn't her husband. He was her hunter. In that flickering blue light, his beaming smile looked like a bared teeth snarl. I thought of my career in bridge inspection, how a single rusted bolt hidden deep in the structural webbing can bring the whole span down without a second of warning. I had walked her down the aisle. I had placed her hand in the palm of a monster and felt proud of the man she had chosen. The smell of stale coffee in the unit felt suffocating as the weight of my own failure crushed the air from my lungs. The sharp edges of the evidence photos on the screen seemed to cut into my eyes. I felt the bile rise in my throat as Ilara pulled up a second folder, her face going grim as she whispered, "And that isn't even the worst of it, Brooks. He has a life we never saw." I stared at the monitors, realizing the man I had called my son was a structural lie of the most lethal kind. Garrison stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder labeled Kendrick, Secondary. He didn't speak. He simply slid a glossy surveillance photo across the metal desk, the image cutting through my composure like a jagged piece of glass. I stared down at the photograph, and for a moment the steady hum of the safe house air purifier seemed to stop entirely. The image showed Garrett Kendrick standing in a sunny driveway in Columbus, Ohio. He wasn't wearing his tailored Atlanta suits. He was in a t-shirt and jeans, looking relaxed in a way I had never seen. Beside him stood a woman with blonde hair, and gripping his hand was a 5-year-old boy. The child had Garrett's exact jawline, the same high forehead, and the same inquisitive tilt of the head. This was taken 3 weeks ago. Garrison said the faint smell of his leather holster drifting toward me in the cramped space. He is not just a mole, Brooks. He is a bigamist with a documented active second life. That boy. I whispered, my teeth clicking together as I clenched my jaw. He looks just like Garrett did in those old surveillance photos you showed me. The sickening realization of a double-layered betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While Garrett was supposedly traveling for business or spending late nights at the office in Atlanta, he was actually maintaining a legal life with a primary family that had no idea Juniper existed. He has a son, Garrison said, his voice flat and clinical. An 8-year-old boy named Caleb. His real wife, her name is Miranda, lives in a safe house in Macon under a false identity provided by the Covenant. She thinks Garrett is a traveling consultant. The boy has no idea his father is married to someone else. The boss has known about them the entire time. He's been holding Caleb's safety over Garrett's head for years, Brooks. If Garrett ever tried to back out, if he ever showed mercy to your family, the Covenant would kill the boy. That's how they ensure loyalty, not through money or ideology, but through the threat of murdering the people their soldiers love most. Caleb is the anchor that keeps Garrett chained to this nightmare. Ilara moved closer, the flickering blue light from the monitors reflecting off the folder in my hands. She detailed how Garrett managed the logistics, utilizing the Covenant's vast resources to create shell companies and airtight travel itineraries. Every holiday, every anniversary, and even the emergencies that called him away from our dinner table were calculated rotations between his two worlds. He was a house with 2 front doors, and we were the ones locked in the basement of his lies. The structural integrity of my entire reality was now completely liquidated, leaving me with a sense of intellectual vertigo that made the floor feel like it was pitching beneath my feet. He's been playing both sides of the fence for a decade. Ilara said, her voice tight with a cold, professional fury. Juniper was the job. Ohio was the life. Or maybe it was the other way around. It didn't matter. The result was the same. My daughter had spent 8 years sharing a bed with a man who was essentially a ghost, a master of mirrors who had erased our true presence to satisfy a mission of revenge. I stared at the photo of the young boy, realizing he was the true blood legacy of the man Ilara had put in prison. He wasn't just lying to us. He was erasing us. I saw the cycle of violence being prepped for another generation, a silent blueprint for future destruction. The weight of the brass key in my pocket suddenly transformed from a burden into a weapon, and I felt a cold, sharp-edged determination take hold. I didn't just invite a monster into my house, I said, my voice barely a rasp. I invited a ghost. But the most terrifying part was what Garrison told me next. The Ohio family wasn't just his real life. They were collateral held by the Covenant boss to ensure Garrett followed through with our execution. My fingers curled into a fist as I looked at Garrison and whispered, "We're out of time, aren't we?" And he didn't even have to look at the monitors to give me the answer. Holding my phone felt like holding a live grenade. One wrong word, one tremor in my voice, and I'd be the one to pull the pin on my daughter's life. I reached for the device in the quiet sanctuary of the safe house, my thumb hovering over Juniper's contact name, while my vision swam. Behind me, Ilara stood like a statue carved from ice, her hand gripping my shoulder with a strength that was far more tactical than comforting. I wasn't just calling to hear her voice. I was the bait for a digital trap, a means for Garrison to ping the exact GPS location of Garrett's vehicle. My engineering mind tried to calculate the exact frequency of a father's voice, a tone that wouldn't betray a man who had just seen his wife rise from the dead. I hit dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each tone sounding like a hammer, striking a hollow iron pipe in my ears. "Breathe, Brooks," Ilara whispered, her breath hot against my neck. "You're her father. Just her father." I closed my eyes, trying to find the man I was before the funeral, before the brass key, before the lies. "I don't know if I can lie to her," I murmured. But then the line clicked open. Daddy Juniper's voice was raw, exhausted, from a day of burying a mother who was currently standing 3 inches away from me. "I was just about to call you. Garrett said we needed some air, that the house was getting too small." I heard the low, steady thrum of a car engine in the background, and then the distinct, rhythmic click of a turn signal. It was a mundane sound, the kind you hear 1,000 times a day, but now it sounded like the ticking of a countdown. A phone call is just a bridge made of air, and right now I was watching mine crumble before I could even cross it. "Where are you, sweetheart?" I asked, forcing my voice into a mold of weary concern. "Exactly where we're just heading out for a private dinner," she said, her breathing shallow. "Somewhere near the river. Garrett wants to escape the mourners. How do you tell your child the man she's sleeping next to is a sleeper agent, without making her the next casualty?" I could practically feel Garrett's presence through the speaker, likely holding the steering wheel with one hand while the other scanned the mirrors. "Tell Garrett to drive safe," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It gets foggy near the river this time of year." I heard a muffled exchange in the car, a low rumble of a male voice I once trusted. "He says he's got it," Daddy Juniper replied, her voice trailing off. "He says he's taking care of everything." That casual mention chilled me to the bone. It was a confirmation of absolute isolation. He had already moved her away from her friends, her cousins, and now he was moving her away from the world. I ended the call with a hollow promise to see her tomorrow, a word that felt like a cruel joke. I hung up and looked at Garrison, who was staring at a map on a glowing monitor. A blinking red dot was heading straight for the industrial district, far from any reputable restaurant. He looked at me, his face grim, and whispered the words that stopped my heart. "He's not going to a restaurant, Brooks. He's taking her into the dark." Garrison's fingers blurred across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the cold blue phosphor of the monitors as he chased a ghost across the digital grid of Atlanta. I stood paralyzed behind him, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic, uneven rhythm that mirrored the stuttering red dot on the screen. The flickering blue light of the monitors cast long, skeletal shadows against the corrugated metal walls of the safe house, making the room feel like an industrial tomb. I watched as Juniper's GPS signal deviated sharply from the main thoroughfare, abandoning the path to any reputable restaurant or commercial district. Garrett wasn't just driving her. He was being followed by a tactical backup team from the Covenant to ensure the job was finished. Garrison pulled up a live traffic feed from a nearby intersection, the grainy texture of the footage highlighting the silver sedan as it blew through a yellow light. The car moved with a terrifying, purposeful speed that mocked the pretense of a casual dinner. "He's heading for the old cotton district," Garrison muttered, his eyes never leaving the display. "There's nothing there but rust and regret." I leaned over his shoulder, my cold sweat soaking into the collar of my shirt. "Zoom in," I demanded, my voice cracking. "I need to see if she's still in the passenger seat." A second camera feed flickered to life, capturing a black SUV falling in behind Garrett's car, the same heavy-framed vehicle Ilara had identified from the cemetery surveillance. Information is like a lifeline in a storm, and I was watching ours fray to a single shivering thread. That SUV has been following them since they left the cemetery gates. Ilara whispered, her hand tightening on my arm until it bruised. "He's not just her husband anymore, Brooks. He's her escort to the execution." The structural integrity of my composure finally snapped. I saw the coordination, the sheer scale of the entrapment, and realized my daughter was being delivered to a welcoming party of monsters. We watched the silver sedan and its predator escort turn toward the shadow of a massive derelict warehouse near the riverbank. The ozone from the overheating computers filled my nostrils, a sharp metallic tang that signaled the end of the line. Just as the vehicles slipped into the blind spot of the last functioning street camera, the red dot on Garrison's monitor flickered once and vanished. Black. The screen went as black as a fresh grave. The signal lost alert began to flash in a haunting, rhythmic red pulse against the safe house wall. "The signal's gone," Garrison barked into his headset. "He's jammed it." A deliberate kill command had been sent to the phone to prevent us from following any further. "She's in the dark, Garrison." I choked out the air in the room, suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. "My baby is in the dark." I stared at the empty screen, the silence in the room so heavy I could hear the hum of the computer fans like the buzzing of flies. The voyeuristic terror of the digital pursuit had been replaced by a total suffocating panic that threatened to drown me. Garrison didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling the monitors, and shouted into his headset with a raw, tactical urgency. "They're at the river. Launch the birds." The calm efficiency of the safe house evaporated in a heartbeat, replaced by the staccato bark of Garrison's orders and the high-pitched whine of drones launching from a hidden bay on the roof. My ears rang with the sudden surge of tactical noise, a chaotic symphony that signaled the end of the digital shadow dance. Garrison wasn't just launching eyes into the sky. He explained as he worked that these birds were equipped with electromagnetic pulse emitters. If the situation turned, he was prepared to fry every circuit in that district, even if it meant losing our own connection. I watched the monitors flicker and roll as they switched to thermal imaging, scanning the rusted skeletons of the Chattahoochee Industrial District. The smell of hot electronics and ozone filled the small room, a sharp metallic reminder that we were no longer just observers. Ilara stood frozen beside me, her eyes tracking the movement of green and gray heat signatures on the screen with a practiced, predatory focus. It was the look of a hunter who had found a trail, and it terrified me as much as the threat to our daughter. "I need eyes on that warehouse," Garrison shouted into his headset. "If they go inside, we lose the thermal lock. Brooks, stay back from the consoles. You're vibrating so hard, you're going to trip a sensor." I didn't realize I was shaking until I tried to steady myself against the metal desk. The reality of the total system blackout hit me like a physical blow. Without the phone's GPS, we were guessing based on trajectory, throwing high-tech darts in the dark. I began to pace the narrow aisle of the safe house, my engineer's mind spiraling as I calculated the sheer surface area of the abandoned warehouses. Have you ever watched your world turn into a series of green and gray heat blobs on a screen and realized your heart was the only thing still warm in the room? I felt a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck as the scale of the trap became clear. "He's playing with us, Ilara," I said, my voice cracking. He knew we were watching. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on a graining image of a massive iron structure. "No, Brooks," she replied, her voice devoid of the warmth that had defined our marriage. "He doesn't know about the safe house. He's just following the protocol his father taught him." Silence is the first rule of the hit. The drone feed finally reached the old cotton warehouse, but the thick, rusted metal roof acted as a heat shield, rendering the thermal sensors useless. We could see the white-hot glow of the SUV's engine idling outside like a beacon of malice, but the interior was a black, impenetrable void. Garrison swore as the screen filled with digital artifacts and static. "We're blind," he growled. "The interior is dead air. He's used a localized scrambler." Nothing. The warehouse was a tomb of cold iron. "Then we go," I said, the helplessness in my chest turning into a sharp, jagged resolve. "Now, before the dark becomes permanent." Ilara finally turned to me, her face grim. She revealed she had known about this specific warehouse for years. It was a Covenant cleaning station, a place designed for making people vanish. I watched the static dance on the monitor, a blizzard of gray and black, and realized with a sickening lurch that the only way to see what was happening to my daughter was to walk into the darkness myself. Ilara didn't look at me as she reached under the console and pulled out a tactical vest. To understand the monster currently holding my daughter, I had to look back at the day my wife accidentally created him. She stood bathed in the blue-tinted light of the safe house, her eyes distant, as she transported me back to 1995, to the jagged remains of the Covenant's main headquarters during the final federal raid. I could almost smell the plaster dust and cordite hanging in the air of that memory. Amidst the tactical chaos and the falling masonry of the leader's office, she had discovered young Garrett, an 8-year-old with eyes as cold and still as frozen pond water, sat amidst the wreckage of a billion-dollar empire without shedding a single tear. While the federal agents were scrambling to secure millions in illegal ledgers and shouting orders, Ilara had locked eyes with the child. "He didn't cry," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. "He didn't even blink while we hauled his father away in chains. He wasn't a random recruit swept up in the aftermath. He was a disciple specifically groomed by the boss since the age of 8 to exact this exact revenge." I thought he was a victim back then. My heart broke for the boy sitting in the ruins. I was wrong. He wasn't a victim. He was an apprentice watching his world burn and memorizing the faces of the people holding the matches. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a timer ticking for 30 years. Ilara explained that the Covenant leader hadn't left his legacy to chance. He had spent years conditioning the boy to view the law not as a shield, but as a gang of thieves who stole his birthright. My rhythmic thumping pulse drummed in my ears as the horror of the conditioning sank in. "We thought we were saving him," Brooks Ilara said, her fingers tracing the cold, tactile edge of an old evidence photo on the monitor. The boss was already whispering instructions into his ear through the prison glass, before the ink on the arrest warrants was even dry. He was 8. I found myself asking how an 8-year-old could carry that much hate, but the answer was staring at me from the screen. Hate is a structural flaw that grows in the dark, and we were the ones who turned out the lights. Ilara's confession took a darker turn as she admitted she was the one who personally signed the paperwork for Garrett's childhood relocation into the foster system, believing it was the only way to give him a clean slate. She had unintentionally provided the perfect cover he needed to grow up, change his name, and begin his long-game hunt for our family. She was the unwitting architect of our own infiltration, the one who handed the wolf the key to the sheepfold. I looked at the monitors at the dark warehouse by the river and realized Garrett wasn't just working for a criminal boss. He was trying to win back the father my wife had taken from him. The haunting image of those young frozen eyes stayed with me, a ghost, raised for war, who was now standing over my daughter with a knife hidden in his smile. We weren't just fighting a mole. We were fighting 30 years of patient, nurtured rage. I slammed my fist onto the workstation's cold metal surface, the vibration rattling the monitors and snapping the heavy silence of the safe house. The sting in my hand was a sharp, welcome distraction from the suffocating terror clawing at my throat. I stood over the consoles looking at the black void on the screens where my daughter's life was being erased in real time. "You are an Agent Garrison, but I am her father," I said, my voice vibrating with a raw, paternal ferocity I hadn't felt in decades. "I am the only bridge she has left. I am not sitting here while she is trapped in a cleaning station." Garrison didn't move, his eyes fixed on the rolling logs of the drone feed. "You'll get yourself killed before you even reach the perimeter, Brooks." He countered, his tone clipped and professional. "My team is moving as fast as the protocols allow." But as I watched him, I saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. My engineering mind, trained to spot the slightest structural shift, realized that Garrison wasn't just following a manual. He was under orders to capture the Covenant boss alive, even if that priority increased the risk to Juniper. Have you ever looked at a federal agent and realized that to him, your daughter's life is just a line item in a budget? I wasn't going to let her be the acceptable loss in his career-making bust. Before I reveal the truth about the equipment I was about to carry, I want to check in with you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the intensity and grip of this story so far? Drop your score in the comments with a quick reason why. Please note, the next part includes recreated details for narrative purposes to deepen the emotional impact. Ilara stepped into the light, her face a mask of tactical resolve. "She was right, Thane," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Garrett doesn't fear the Bureau. He fears his own conscience, and he only listens to family." She began pulling tactical gear from a hidden locker, the metallic click of the buckles echoing like a clock ticking down. Garrison realized he had lost control of his witnesses. "Fine," he barked, pulling a comms earpiece from his pocket. "But you follow my lead, or I will have you both in federal custody before the sun rises." The preparation was a blur of steel and nylon. Brooks was fitted with a low-profile tactical vest, the weight of it pulling at my shoulders, making the danger feel physical rather than digital. The cold glare of the fluorescent lights glinted off the gear. Ilara adjusted the straps of my vest, her eyes meeting mine with a secret, fierce intensity. As she did, she leaned in her body, shielding the movement, as she slipped something into a hidden pocket of her own rig, a secondary personal insurance policy that I knew Garrison hadn't authorized. I could smell the gun oil and the faint scent of floor wax in the cramped space. Garrison stepped toward me, his face grave. "Don't be a hero, Brooks. Just be a father." At this point, Garrison, I don't see the difference. I replied, the static hum of the earpiece already beginning to buzz in my ear. Click. The earpiece fit like a death sentence. Garrison handed me the comms unit, his eyes searching mine for a crack in my foundation. But all he found was the cold, hard steel of a man who had nothing left to lose. The humidity of the Chattahoochee hit me like a physical blow, a wet, heavy shroud that smelled of river mud and dying industries. As we stepped out from the sterile, filtered air of the storage complex, the night swallowed us whole. I felt the cold weight of the comms earpiece in my ear, a tiny vibrating link to Garrison that felt increasingly flimsy against the vast, dark silence of the riverbank. We moved through a dense wall of riverbank vegetation, following a path that looked like nothing more than shadows and rot to me. Ilara, however, navigated the terrain with a terrifying, silent fluidity I had never witnessed in 3 decades of marriage. She wasn't the librarian I had shared coffee with every morning. She was a predator returning to a familiar hunting ground. I noticed her hand snap out in a series of sharp signals flicks of the wrist, and positioned fingers I didn't recognize. It was clear her retirement had been a lie even to me. She had maintained specialized training while I was busy inspecting bridge joints. "Watch your step, Brooks," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the humid air. "Sound travels over water better than it does over land." "You've done this before," I murmured, stumbling over a rusted machinery skeleton. "This exact walk." She didn't answer, her focus fixed on the hulking silhouette of the abandoned cotton warehouse that loomed out of the fog. It was a cathedral of corrugated iron and rotted timber, its jagged edges illuminated by flickering orange perimeter lamps that cast jittery finger-like shadows. This warehouse was a rusted lung, and we were the unwanted breath being sucked into its dark, hollow chest. My inspector's eye immediately mapped the structural decay, the sagging roofline, the deep fractures in the brickwork, and the heavy reinforced steel doors. Garrett had chosen this place well. The thickness of those walls would dampen any scream. "East wall is compromised," I whispered, pointing to a visible tilt in the masonry. "If we have to run, we go through the loading dock. It's the only path with structural integrity." She nodded, her eyes scanning for sentries. "Check your comms," she said. "Once we go in, garrison is our only lifeline." The crickets, which had been a deafening chorus moments ago, suddenly went silent, leaving a void of sound that made my ears ring. We reached the service entrance, a small dented door hidden behind a stack of rusted chemical drums. The smell of stagnant river water and old oil was overpowering here, a metallic cocktail that tasted of fear. I felt the brass key in my pocket, the object that had exhumed my life, and realized it wouldn't open this door. Creak. The metal groaned like a dying man as I tested the handle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a terrifying, irreversible commitment taking hold of my limbs. The door wasn't locked from the outside. It had been left ajar, a silent invitation for us to walk into the center of the trap. I looked at Alara, seeing her check that hidden insurance policy in her gear one last time. "Ready?" she asked. "No," I replied, my voice a dry rasp. "But I'm going anyway." I gripped the cold handle, and as the door swung inward without a sound, the first thing I saw in the flickering light was the back of my daughter's head and the man she loved holding a gun to it. The interior was a cathedral of rot, vast and echoing with the sound of the river against the pilings. The smell of rotting cotton and stagnant river water was nothing compared to the metallic scent of my own fear as I stepped into that hollow cathedral of rust. Beside me, Alara moved like a phantom, her presence almost undetectable as our eyes adjusted to the pitch-black shadows that hid decades of industrial decay. In the very center of the massive space, a single industrial lamp hung from a frayed cable, swaying slightly. It cast a harsh, flickering orange cone of light that seemed to carve a stage out of the absolute darkness. "Stay low," Alara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The echoes in here are our worst enemy." I felt the cold weight of the comms earpiece, but there was only static now, the warehouse's iron skin acting as a shield against the outside world. "I see her, Alara," I murmured, my heart doing a jagged dance against my ribs. "I see our little girl." Juniper was tied to a heavy wooden chair in the dead center of the light. Her face was streaked with tears, mascara running in black rivulets down her cheeks. Her wrists were bound so tightly with nylon rope that I could see the red welts even from the shadows. A gag was tied cruelly around her mouth, cutting into the corners of her lips. But what broke me wasn't the physical restraints, it was her eyes. They were wide, glassy, and utterly defeated, the eyes of someone who had already given up hope of rescue. My brilliant daughter, the pediatric cardiologist, who spent her days saving children's hearts, looked like a broken doll discarded in the center of a stage built for her execution. Garrett Kendrick stood directly behind her, his hand resting on the back of the chair, with a proprietary coldness that made my blood boil. He had meticulously lit the warehouse to ensure that whoever came for her would see exactly what he wanted them to see, a victim ready for the end. The man my daughter once called perfection was gone, replaced by a calculated predator who looked right through the darkness toward our position as if he had been counting our heartbeats. A bridge collapses when the load exceeds the strength of the steel. In this room, my heart was the bridge, and the sight of my daughter was a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. Every instinct I possessed as a father screamed at me to run into that circle of light, to tear Garrett apart with my bare hands. Don't look at his eyes. Brooks Ilara signaled, her hand clamping onto my arm with bruising force. Look at his hands. He's waiting for us. This isn't a hiding spot. It's a stage. As I prepared to step forward, the shadows around the light began to shift. The flickering orange light revealed the silhouettes of 4 men stepping out from behind rusted machinery, their rifles leveled at the entrance. Click. The sound of 4 safeties being switched off echoed like a firing squad. My strategic despair deepened as I realized we were outnumbered and outgunned. Garrison better be as close as he says he is. I thought, though, the silence in my ear told a different story. These Covenant guards weren't just there to protect Garrett. They stood with a rigid, watchful posture that suggested they were there to ensure he followed through with the hit, preventing any last-minute mercy for the family he had lived with for a decade. Garrett slowly raised his gaze to the shadows, where we stood, his face illuminated by the swaying lamp, and he smiled a cold, empty smile that told me he'd been counting our footsteps from the moment we crossed the river. He knew we were there, and he knew we had nowhere left to run. Ilara squeezed my hand. Once a silent goodbye, or a promise of war, I didn't know which. And then she stepped into the cone of light. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into that harsh circle of light with the terrifying grace of a predator returning to a kill she'd never actually finished. The flicker of the industrial lamp overhead cast deep, rhythmic shadows across her face, making her look less like my wife and more like a vengeful spirit conjured from the river fog. "Surprise, Garrett?" she said, her voice cutting through the smell of ozone and wet timber like a sharpened blade. "I'm not as easy to bury as a few sandbags." Tied to the heavy wooden chair, Juniper let out a muffled, strangled cry behind her gag, her body bucking against the ropes. Mom Juniper's voice cracked after Garrett ripped the gag away, barely a whisper that sounded like glass breaking. Her face went white, then red, then white again, as shock and disbelief collided in real time. Tears spilled down her cheeks in fresh torrents. You're alive! How is this?" How she tried to stand, but her legs buckled, still weak from hours of captivity. Her entire body shook with sobs that were equal parts relief and absolute cognitive fracture. She looked at her mother like she was staring at a ghost, her brain visibly struggling to reconcile the woman she had buried with the woman standing 10 feet away, alive and armed. Her eyes were wide, blown out, with a mixture of hysterical joy and absolute cognitive dissonance as she stared at the mother she had watched vanish into the Georgia clay. Garrett's hand, which had been resting with proprietary coldness on the back of Juniper's chair, began to twitch. The calculated predatory mask he had worn since the cemetery didn't just crack. It shattered. His brain was clearly struggling to reconcile the tactical finality of the heart attack report with the breathing, lethal woman standing 10 feet away. He looked at her like a man looking at his own executioner. I saw the medical reports myself." Garrett stammered, his face turning the color of ash. "I personally checked the hospital logs. I saw the casket go into the ground." Ilara tilted her head, a cold, predatory smile playing on her lips. "You saw what a professional wanted you to see, Garrett. You were always just an amateur playing at my game, and you've spent 10 years failing to notice the structural flaws in your own infiltration. A lie is a structural flaw. Once it's exposed to the light, the whole building starts to groan." I stepped out from the shadows, then flanking Ilara, my heart hammering a war drum against my ribs. I felt the cold weight of the comms unit in my ear, useless now that the iron walls had claimed our signal. But I didn't need Garrison to tell me what to do next. The Covenant guards tightened their grips on their rifles, their eyes darting toward Garrett for a command that wouldn't come. He was trapped in a mental loop, the conditioned loyalty to his prison father, colliding head-on with the sheer impossibility of our presence. "Let her go, Garrett," I said, my voice echoing in the cathedral of rot. "It is over. Every 'I love you' you whispered to my daughter for 8 years was a debt you can never repay." He looked at me, then back at Alara, his eyes glazed with a rising panic. "It is never over," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "He said it would never be over. He told me you were gone." Garrett's eyes darted toward a laptop resting on a crate near the chair, and I saw the moment his fear of the living woman was replaced by an even greater terror of the man watching from prison. He wasn't just a husband who had been caught. He was a disciple who had failed his God. He admitted he was the one who confirmed the death to the boss, the one who guaranteed the Sterlings were no longer a threat. Now standing in the flickering orange light, he knew the price of being wrong. I stepped closer, my shadow merging with Alara's, and looked my daughter in the eye. I looked into my daughter's eyes, and for a second, I saw the exact moment her entire reality turned to ash. Juniper was tied to that chair, the industrial light overhead, swaying and making the shadows dance across her tear-streaked face. Garrett stood there frozen, but I didn't care about his shock anymore. I had to deliver the blow that would finally sever the cord between them. I reached into the pocket of my tactical vest and pulled out the glossy surveillance photo Garrison had given me. It felt heavy, a piece of evidence that carried the weight of a death sentence. I dropped it at Juniper's feet. The bigamy reveal was the only way to destroy Garrett's leverage over her heart. "He's not just a criminal, Juniper," I said, my voice steady despite the stinging heat in my eyes. "He's a bigamist. He has a primary wife and a biological son in Columbus, Ohio, who looks just like him." I looked at Garrett, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Tell her, Garrett. Tell her about the woman in Columbus. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every single emergency that took him away from our family was just a return to his real life. A bridge doesn't just snap. It corrodes from the inside until the mere weight of a shadow can bring it down. 11 years of rust had just met the light." Juniper's muffled sobbing grew louder, a strangled sound of absolute despair. I forced her to face the decaying decade of her life. 11 years, honey. 3 years of dating and 8 years of marriage. All for a ledger and a prison grudge. You weren't his wife. You were his assignment, a tool to bypass your mother's defenses. He targeted you when you were 16, a child, because the Covenant boss told him to. The smell of grease and wet iron in the warehouse felt suffocating as I detailed the cold logistics of their plan. Every holiday, every birthday, even her wedding day, it was all just evidence of a decade-long crime. The weight of the truth seemed to physically crush her, and her cries eventually subsided into a hollow, terrifying silence. 0. That was the value of my daughter's love in his ledger. Garrett finally found his voice, but it wasn't the man Juniper loved speaking. It was the robotic tone of the disciple. He looked at her with a chilling, clinical detachment. It was a mission, he confirmed, his voice echoing in the vast, dark space. "You were always just a mission. I did what I was trained to do. My primary loyalty has always been to the man who raised me from the rubble after your mother destroyed my family." There was no trace of the husband she knew left in him. He had discarded his persona entirely, revealing that every affection he'd shown for 8 years was just a learned behavior, a tactical necessity for the hit. He was a monster who had worn a mask of love until the plastic finally melted. Juniper's head fell forward as she broke her spirit, finally giving way under the structural failure of her life. But Garrett's voice suddenly sharpened as he looked at the laptop glowing with a cold blue light on the crate beside him. He whispered, but then something happened. Something that wasn't in the script. I saw Garrett's voice crack for the first time, a hairline fracture in the stone mask he had worn since we arrived. The chime from the laptop sitting on a nearby crate wasn't a standard notification. It was the sound of a guillotine blade sliding into its starting position. Garrett froze, his gaze fixed on the pixelated glow of the screen as his mask of professional coldness fully dissolved into a raw, unfiltered terror. I stood 3 feet away, the tactile sweat on my palms, making the tactical vest feel like a lead weight against my chest. The laptop screen flickered to life, revealing the high-contrast, shadowed face of the Covenant leader broadcasting from a federal cell. His voice was a gravelly, distorted rasp that filled the hollow warehouse, instantly silencing the rhythmic dripping of the river water. He didn't even look at Alara or me. He spoke directly to Garrett with the terrifying intimacy of a father who owns his son's soul. "You're stalling, Garrett." The boss hissed, his image stuttering with digital artifacts. "I didn't raise you to be a sentimental fool. I am just—" Confirming the targets, Father Garrett stammered, his hand shaking so violently the gun barrel traced erratic circles in the air. "Have you ever seen a man's soul break in real time? It doesn't make a sound, but it's louder than any explosion." I watched as the man who had infiltrated my family for a decade crumbled before a screen. The laptop display split, showing a second grainy live feed of a suburban house in Ohio, the same house I had seen in Garrison's surveillance photos. A man in a dark hoodie stood by the front door, holding a silent, glowing device. Garrett fell to his knees on the cold concrete, the gun dipping toward the floor. "Loyalty is a debt that must be paid in blood," Garrett the boss explained with clinical cruelty. "Either the Sterlings die or your own child does. Leave him out of this." Garrett sobbed, his voice a broken wreck. "He's just a boy." "He is my grandson by law," the boss countered, "and his life is the price of your hesitation." Tick, tick, tick. The countdown wasn't on the screen. It was in Garrett's shaking hand. I realized then that the villain of our story was also a victim, a man whose cooperation was being extorted through the direct threat of his own son's murder. The Covenant boss had anticipated this exact fracture and had placed his own men at Garrett's real home as a lethal failsafe. The warehouse guards shifted their aim, their rifles now targeting Garrett, as well as the three of us awaiting the final order from the screen. "Shoot them now," the boss commanded, his eyes twin pits of darkness in the pixelated light. "Or watch your own legacy die on your front porch. You have 10 seconds. The smell of hot electronics and ozone seemed to thicken in the air. I looked at the gun in my son-in-law's hand, then at the terror in his eyes, and I realized we were all standing on a bridge that was about to go down. The boss leaned into the camera, his hissed ultimatum echoing off the corrugated iron walls. "Shoot them, Garrett. 1 life for 3. Make the choice." I watched my daughter tied to that chair, and then I looked back at the man who was being forced to choose between his mission and his blood. I stepped into the line of fire, not because I was brave, but because a bridge inspector knows that when a structure is failing, you have to reinforce the point of greatest tension with everything you've got. I moved between Garrett's shaking handgun and my daughter, putting my back to her, as if my own flesh could serve as a shield against the decades of poison Garrett had been fed. The gravelly distortion of the Covenant boss's voice continued to scream from the laptop screen, a frantic, pixelated ghost demanding blood. "Garrett, look at me," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a grounded authority that seemed to startle even the guards in the shadows. "Not the screen. Look at the man who sat across from you at Thanksgiving for a decade. Look at the man who taught you how to fix a carburetor and trusted you with his daughter's heart." Garrett's eyes were streaming with tears, his white-knuckled grip on the handgun, betraying a conflict that was tearing him apart from the inside. "You were a boy who lost a father." Once I continued stepping closer until I could feel the heat of the gun barrel near my chest. "I know what that does to a soul, Garrett. I've seen it in your eyes at every family dinner. Don't become a man who destroys another soul to avenge a ghost. Look at Juniper. She isn't a mission. She's the woman who knows how you take your coffee. She's the woman who stayed up all night when you had the flu. She's the woman who actually loved you, Garrett, not the weapon they trained you to be. If you pull that trigger, you're not killing us. You're killing the only family who ever saw you as human." I took another step, my voice breaking. "Your son Caleb is 8 years old, Garrett. The same age you were when they took your father from you. If you do this, you're teaching him that revenge is worth more than love. Is that the legacy you want? Do you want him to grow up to be another disciple of a dead man's hate? Or do you want him to be free? If you've ever had to beg for your child's life, you know that your voice doesn't come from your throat. It comes from the very center of your bones. I could taste the salt of my own tears as I spoke, the scent of old oil and river mud thick in the warehouse air. I revealed then that I was recording every word through my comms earpiece, and that Garrison's team was already using his confession to pinpoint the location of the boy in Ohio. Garrison has a tactical team minutes from your house in Columbus, Garrett. If you make the right choice now, the FBI can protect your son. We can end this cycle of blood right here. What kind of man do you want him to be? A disciple of a ghost or a free man? His soul was a rusted bolt, and I was the wrench trying to turn it before the whole structure collapsed. Garrett admitted through a choked sob that he hadn't just tracked Juniper out of duty. He had sought us out because he was starving for the family warmth he had seen Alara offer during that 1995 raid. He wanted to be a Sterling, not a Kendrick. 3 seconds, Garrett the boss screamed from the crate, his pixelated face contorted with rage. Kill them or the boy dies, Uncooktuktum. I saw Garrett's finger tighten on the trigger, the tension in the room reaching a point beyond physical limits. I can't let him be you, Garrett. Whispered his voice, a broken, jagged thing. The standoff became a deafening physical force, a silence so heavy it felt like it would crush us all. Juniper watched my back, her muffled cries going silent as she witnessed the final fracture of the man she had loved. Garrett's arm suddenly pivoted with a violent, desperate energy. Instead of pointing the muzzle at my chest or Juniper's head, he leveled it directly at the pixelated face of the man who had raised him to be a killer. He wasn't aiming at us. He was aiming at the source of his own haunting. The gunshot wasn't an ending. It was a thunderous declaration of independence that shattered the pixelated face of a tyrant and threw the warehouse into instant, violent chaos. Garrett fired directly into the laptop, the screen erupting in a violent spray of sparks and liquid crystal. The rasping, distorted voice of the Covenant boss was cut off mid-threat, plunging the center of the warehouse into a ringing silence that lasted for only a fraction of a heartbeat. I watched as Garrett immediately dropped the gun. His first instinct upon betraying his mentor wasn't to flee or bargain, but to dive toward Juniper with desperate speed. He threw his own body over hers, shielding her bound form with his own chest, as a human shield against the 4 Covenant guards, who finally realized they had been betrayed. "Get down now," he roared, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed emotion. The guards were already pivoting, their faces twisting with a cold, professional fury that signaled our immediate execution. "Traitor, kill them all," one of them shouted, his rifle rising to level with the back of Garrett's head. Before the guards could adjust their aim, the warehouse's main corrugated doors were blown inward by a series of high-velocity shaped charges. The sound was a tectonic shift, a pressure wave that hit my chest and knocked the absolute breath from my lungs. Flashbang grenades arced through the smoke-filled air, detonating in a blinding sequence of white light and ear-shattering concussions that froze the Covenant members where they stood. Flash. Boom. The world turned white and stayed that way. My engineering mind, ever the surveyor of structural stability, identified the exact breach points by the way the floor vibrated beneath me as the FBI tactical teams swarmed the perimeter. "FBI, drop your weapons, drop them now," the commands echoed through the hollow space like thunder. I felt a surge of sudden heat as I grabbed Alara, pulling her down behind a stack of rusted chemical drums, just as the first exchange of fire began. "Brooks, Alara, stay on the ground." Thane Garrison's voice cut through the metallic ringing in my ears, sharp and authoritative. He led the charge through the swirling haze, his weapon leveled with surgical precision. The warehouse was no longer a structure. It was a drum being beaten by the heavy hammers of a dozen automatic rifles, I could smell the sharp tang of cordite and ozone, the scent of a battle that had been 30 long years in the making. Garrison moved through the smoke like a shadow, his team fanning out to secure the center. "Secure the girl, secure the target," he barked. I realized then that the breach wasn't just a panicked reaction to Garrett's shot. Garrison had been using my active comms to monitor every heartbeat of our conversation, timing the explosion for the exact second the boss's face vanished from the screen. Through the haze of thick smoke and the strobe-like effect of the flickering industrial lamp, I saw one of the Covenant guards recover. He leveled his rifle with terrifying focus at Garrett's exposed back, ignoring the tactical team for one last act of dark retribution. I realized the man who had just saved my daughter by choosing to be a father instead of a weapon was about to pay for that choice with his life. The first bullet missed Garrett's head by an inch, sparks flying off the industrial lamp behind him, as the warehouse erupted into a symphony of controlled gunfire and tactical precision. I felt the rough tactile feel of the tactical vest against my chest. As I stayed low, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that signaled the end of the world as I knew it. Agent Garrison didn't hesitate. He neutralized the guard aiming at Garrett's back with a single clinical shot to the shoulder that sent the rifle clattering to the concrete. Just then, a sharp, concussive pulse rippled through the air, the EMP device Ilara had been carrying as her secondary insurance policy. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate tactic to kill the warehouse lights and fry any remote detonators the Covenant might have possessed. The room plunged into pitch black, leaving only the green-tinted shadows of night vision to guide the tactical team. I watched through the haze as the superior numbers of the FBI swarmed the remaining guards, finishing the siege in near-total darkness, while I huddled against the rusted chemical drums. "Clear. All targets down the shout," echoed through the hollow space. As the emergency backup lights flickered on, Garrison moved toward the center of the warehouse. He used a combat knife to slice through Juniper's bonds with 2 swift strokes. She collapsed forward, but she didn't reach for Ilara. She didn't reach for anyone. She tumbled toward the floor, her body trembling with a shock so profound it transcended physical pain. I pushed past the agents to catch her, my fingers fumbling with the cruel gag that had silenced her. The bridge had been saved from the demolition crew, but the foundation was so cracked that even a whisper felt like it might cause a total collapse. "It is Daddy, honey. You are safe. I have got you," I whispered, trying to pull her into my arms. She stiffened, her eyes glassy and distant, no longer recognizing the man who had raised her. Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice a hollow shell. "It is all fake. It is all fake." The smell of river mud on her clothes was pungent, a reminder of the filth we had all been dragged through. My heart broke as I realized she wasn't just rejecting me. She was rejecting the very concept of a family built on decades of undercover lies. Behind us, Garrett was hauled to his feet by 2 burly agents. His expensive suit was torn, his face a map of bruises and defeat. He didn't resist. Click. The sound of handcuffs was the only wedding ring he had left. He looked toward Juniper with a hollow, pleading expression, but Ilara stepped between them, her gaze cold and unforgiving. Garrison read him his rights with a monotone efficiency as he was led toward a waiting black SUV. The man who had been my son-in-law for 11 years was now just a federal prisoner, a ghost being returned to the shadows. I held my daughter as she shivered, feeling the weight of the structural failure that had decimated our lives. As they loaded Garrett into the vehicle, he looked back at me and mouthed 3 words that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Ohio isn't over." The threat hung in the air like a poisonous fog, a chilling reminder that our survival was far from guaranteed. The sirens of the approaching ambulances cut through the humid night air, a mournful wail that felt like the final funeral song for the life I used to know. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room were a jagged contrast to the warehouse's shadows, exposing the cracks in our family that no amount of medical care could ever stitch back together. I stood by as the paramedics handed Juniper over to the hospital trauma team, my boots squeaking on the pristine white linoleum. The sterile environment felt hostile, a bleached world of antiseptic and floor wax that offered no comfort for the mud-caked reality we had just fled. Juniper remained catatonic, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind the doctors, refusing to acknowledge the hands reaching out to stabilize her. The lead trauma physician, a tired woman in her 50s with kind eyes, pulled me aside in the hallway. "She's suffering from acute dissociative shock, Mr. Sterling," she explained, her voice low and clinical. "Physically, she has severe dehydration, bruising around her wrists and ankles consistent with prolonged restraint, and early signs of hypothermia from exposure. We're treating her for all of that, but the psychological trauma is far more severe. She's built a wall, a mental barrier to protect herself from processing what happened. Right now, anyone connected to the trauma, including you and your wife, represents a threat to that wall. She needs time, space, and professional intervention before she can let you back in." I felt a structural failure in my own chest as I realized my daughter wasn't just physically exhausted. Her spirit had effectively evacuated the premises. The hospital safety protocols were immediate and cold, turning Alara and me into outsiders before we could even explain ourselves. Because of the nature of the assault, we were restricted from the primary trauma bay, forced to watch from behind the thick glass of the waiting area. Alara tried to step toward the gurney as it moved, but Juniper's hand spasmed, a reflexive jerk away from her mother's touch that left the air between them vibrating with rejection. Flinch. That one movement hurt worse than the warehouse guards' rifles ever could. I watched the devastation on Alara's face, a professional agent's mask, finally failing to hide the raw heartbreak of a mother who had returned from the dead, only to be treated like a ghost. In the background, Thane Garrison remained a silent sentinel leaning against a vending machine while coordinating with a team in Ohio over an encrypted line. His presence was a constant low-frequency hum of a reminder that the danger hadn't fully dissipated with Garrett's arrest. "Let the doctors work Alara," I said, my voice sounding hollow as I led her toward the cold, tactile feel of the waiting room plastic chairs. "She needs space." Alara looked at me, her eyes wet and ancient. She looked at me like I was one of them brooks, she whispered. Like I was the monster. "A bridge doesn't just need steel and concrete. It needs the space between the banks to be trusted. And right now, the gap between us and our daughter was a mile wide. The hum of hospital ventilation was the only thing filling the silence, until a neurologist finally approached us under the flickering of a faulty ceiling light. He explained that Juniper was suffering from a severe dissociative episode, a mental wall built to protect itself from the trauma of the kidnapping and the impossible resurrection of her mother. He was blunt. For now, we were part of the trauma, not the cure. He revealed that her non-responsiveness wasn't a general shock, but a targeted psychological defense specifically against us. "So we're still ghosts to her," I murmured, realizing that in saving her life, we may have permanently severed the connection to her heart. Garrison suddenly lowered his phone, his face a grim mask of bureaucratic bad news. He walked over to us, ignored the sterile surroundings, and whispered the words that killed the last of my hope. "The team in Ohio just made entry, but the house was empty." The word empty was becoming the recurring theme of my life. Empty coffin, empty promises, and now an empty house in Ohio that meant the nightmare wasn't finished. It was just relocating. We drove back to our Atlanta home in a heavy, oppressive silence that felt thicker than the Georgia humidity. As I pulled the truck into the driveway, the familiar silhouette of the house seemed like a stranger's property, a stage where I had played a role I didn't even know was scripted. We went inside to gather Juniper's things, moving like ghosts through our own history. I walked into Juniper's old bedroom, a space preserved like a museum of a time before Garrett Kendrick ever existed. The air smelled of old gymnastic chalk and lavender. I touched an old gymnastics trophy on the shelf, the metal cool and honest against my palm. It was a sharp contrast to the structural lies that had compromised our foundation. I realized with a stabbing ache that while we had saved her life, the girl who lived in this room, who trusted the world without reservation, was gone forever. I keep looking for the cracks in the walls, Ilara, I said, as she appeared in the doorway. I forgot the foundation was never solid to begin with. We did what we had to do to keep her here, Brooks, she replied, but her voice lacked its usual tactical certainty. Can you ever truly forgive the person who saved your life by breaking your heart? I looked at her, realizing that my genuine, bone-deep grief during the funeral had been used as a tactical asset by the FBI. I had been the perfect cover because my pain was real. I buried you, Ilara. I felt the dirt on my shoes and the hollow failure in my chest. You let me break because you needed the performance to be authentic enough to fool a monster. We migrated to the back porch as a gray, uncertain dawn began to bleed through the trees. The sound of early morning crickets provided the only soundtrack to our reckoning. I didn't need a performance. Brooks, I needed a shield, she said, her voice finally cracking as she leaned against the cool wooden porch railing. Your love for me was the only thing strong enough to hide us from the Covenant. I felt the anger in the air begin to settle, replaced by the crushing weight of our shared responsibility. We were two old pillars holding up a roof that had already blown away in the storm. I looked at my wife, the librarian, the agent, the woman who had spent 20 years paying Leander Finch to act as a failsafe for an empty coffin. Her plan was decades in the making, a bridge built with secret bolts. I reached out my hand, trembling, and found hers. The warmth of her skin was the only truth I had left. Don't ever die on me again, Ilara. Not for any mission, not for any ghost, I whispered. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm. Deal. No more ghosts. We sat in the silence of the dawn, two survivors of a war hidden in plain sight, acknowledging that the path forward was narrow and unstable. I squeezed her hand, feeling the pulse of a woman I'd mourned and found again, but the peace was shattered by the sharp, persistent trill of Garrison's ringtone on my phone. The bright screen was an intrusion into the quiet, a reminder that the world was still waiting to collapse. I pressed the phone to my ear, my knuckles white, expecting another structural failure, but Garrison's voice came through with a clarity that sounded like the first note of a victory march. The golden light of the Georgia sunrise began to spill across the porch, illuminating the wear on the wooden boards and the steady, calm tone of the agent on the other end of the line. The boy is safe, Brooks Garrison said. We located Garrett's son and secured him in a safe house near Columbus, Ohio, just before the Covenant's cleaners could act. The rescue of that child wasn't just a side quest. It was the primary condition Garrett had set for his full cooperation against the boss. With the boy in protective custody, the leverage they held over Garrett's secondary life was officially neutralized. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 30 years. The warmth of Ilara's hand, providing the only ground in a world that was finally stopping its spin. Does Garrett know? I asked, my voice thick with relief. Does he know his son is free? He knows, Garrison replied, and he is talking. He gave us everything. Garrison began to detail the systematic collapse of the empire. Following the warehouse raid, 47 members had been arrested across 6 states in a single coordinated strike. The $1.2 billion ledger found in Garrett's possession provided the FBI with the structural blueprint they needed to dismantle the organization forever. 47. A whole empire reduced to a list of mugshots. I realized then that the bridge Ilara started building back in 1996 had finally reached the other side. It took 30 years, Garrison Moy murmured. 30 years of hiding for one single morning of peace. We moved into the living room, the smell of early morning coffee brewing in the kitchen, offering a mundane comfort that felt almost alien. I picked up the remote, the tactile smoothness of the plastic familiar in my hand, and turned on the television. The blue-tinted flicker of the screen filled the room with breaking news reports of the federal raids. Images of familiar locations and the faces of men we had feared in the shadows for decades flashed across the screen, now labeled as defendants in a massive RICO case. Have you ever felt the air change in a room when a secret finally dies? It's lighter, cleaner, like the first breath after a fire. I looked at Alara, seeing the librarian, and the agent finally merge into a woman who was truly out of the shadows. "Look at that, Alara," I said, pointing at the screen where the Covenant boss was being led away in a jumpsuit. "They are just men, not ghosts." The news anchor announced that the boss was facing so many new federal charges, he was being moved to a supermax facility, ensuring he would never see the sun again. "It's really over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice small. I nodded, but as the screen flickered with images of the arrests, I felt a single heavy stone lift from my chest, only to be replaced by another. The dismantling of the empire was a victory, but I remembered the daughter still lying in a hospital bed, who didn't even know her nightmare was over. The shadow had lifted from the world, but the light hadn't yet reached the one person who needed it most. 30 days of silence followed the loudest night of my life. Healing isn't a sudden surge of light. It's a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of a life you no longer recognize. I stood by the observation window of Quiet Oaks Recovery Center, watching Juniper through the glass. The clinical routine of the residential therapy center was a monotonous ticking of a therapy room clock that underscored every second of our separation. She was sitting in the garden, her hospital ID badge clipped to her sleeve, like a reminder of a professional identity she was desperate to reclaim. I had watched her in a group session earlier, realizing that she was no longer the victim of a kidnapping, but a survivor of a psychological demolition. She looked physically stronger, but her voice when she finally spoke to me during our allotted hour remained a hollow shell. "You look better, Junie," I said, leaning against the cool shade of the garden oaks. "The color is coming back to your face." "Color is just light hitting a surface, Dad," she replied without looking up. "It doesn't mean anything is happening underneath." Juniper revealed she had been secretly corresponding with the FBI to understand Garrett's psychological profile, not out of lingering love, but to dissect her own trauma with surgical precision. Trauma is a structural fire. The flames go out, but you're left walking through a house where the floors might give way at any second. She explained her decision to return to her surgical residency on a limited basis. "The scalpel doesn't lie to me," she said, her fingers tracing a pattern in the dirt. "It does exactly what the physics demand. The operating room is the only place where things are binary, life or death, open or closed, unlike us. I just want you to have a life outside of the hospital again," I murmured, feeling the weight of the gap between us. Silence. It was the only thing we had left in common. Ilara was waiting in the car, still forbidden from direct contact, per the initial therapy plan. She had sent a message with me, not an apology or a tactical update, but a simple memory from Juniper's childhood. I took a breath, smelling the cut grass and the faint antiseptic on the breeze. "Your mother remembers the blue ribbons you won in gymnastics," I said. "She kept them, Junie." I expected a shutdown, but to my shock, she looked at me. "Does she still have the one from the state finals?" she asked. "The one with the frayed edge." It was the first real crack in her psychological wall, a sign that the ghost of her mother was beginning to materialize back into a human being. I felt a surge of cautious hope. But Juniper's next words shifted the foundation again. "I'll have dinner with her," she said, "but only on one condition. I don't want to see the mother she pretended to be. I want to see the agent. I want the truth, not the performance." She looked at me with eyes that finally held a spark of the old Juniper. But the question she asked next made me realize she wasn't just healing. She was preparing for a different kind of surgery on our past. A distant siren wailed in the city, a reminder that while our war was over, the reconstruction was only just beginning. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick and official, carrying the scent of ink and industrial-grade disinfectant that always follows the incarcerated. I discovered it in the morning mail, a certified ghost reaching out from the federal detention center. I sat at the kitchen table, the tactile crinkle of the stationery sounding like dry leaves beneath my thumb. Ilara stood by the counter, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands with a silent professional wariness. We debated for an hour whether to keep it from Juniper. If we keep this from her, we are just building another secret bridge, I said, looking at the sharp black ink on the white-lined paper through the translucent window of the envelope. I realized that hiding truths was the very structural flaw that had nearly collapsed our family in that warehouse. Let her decide if he still has a voice in her world, Ilara finally agreed. I took the letter to the recovery center 5 weeks after the raid, presenting it to Juniper in the quiet garden as her final structural test of the past decade. She sat on a bench under the cool autumn oaks, the wind rustling the branches overhead. Garrett didn't ask for forgiveness in those pages. Instead, he provided a clinical, almost remorseful breakdown of the assignments he had been given. The letter was 3 pages handwritten in the cramped, precise script of a man with too much time to think. It read, "Juniper, I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I know I never will. What I can give you is the truth you deserve. I was 8 years old when your mother helped destroy my family. I watched federal agents drag my father away in chains while I sat in the rubble of our home. The boss, the man who raised me after that, told me every day that the Sterlings were thieves who stole my birthright. He trained me to see you not as a person, but as a target. For years I believed him. But then I met you. You were 16, bright and so full of life that it hurt to look at you. The plan was simple: get close, gain trust, and when the time came, destroy everything. I followed that plan for 11 years. But somewhere in those years, something broke in me. I started to love the lie more than the mission. I loved the way you laughed at my jokes. I loved the way you believed in me when no one else did. I loved being a Sterling more than I ever loved being a disciple. The truth is, I wanted out. I wanted to take you and run. But the boss had Caleb, my real son, the boy I fathered in my other life. He told me if I didn't finish the job, he'd kill him. So I kept lying, kept playing both sides, hoping I could find a way to save everyone. I failed. I named Caleb after your father, Juniper. Even when I was pretending to hate the Sterlings, I couldn't stop respecting the man who showed me what a real father looked like. I hope that tells you something, even if it doesn't change anything. You deserved a real husband. You deserved a real life. I'm sorry I stole that from you. Garrett. He revealed that he had originally planned to flip on the Covenant years ago, but my wife's faked death had convinced him he had no allies left in the light. The most staggering revelation, however, was about his life in Ohio. He wrote that his son was named Brooks. Juniper stared at the page, her fingers trembling against the paper. He named him after you, Dad. Even his betrayals were built on a stolen respect for our family. Ash. That was all that remained of an 11-year marriage in her mind. The letter further revealed that the primary wife in Ohio was actually another FBI informant Ilara had planted years ago, making Garrett's entire second life a closed loop of federal surveillance he never saw coming. Juniper didn't cry. She asked me for a lighter. I watched the paper curl and blacken in the cold air, the smoke carrying away the last remnants of Garrett Kendrick. She watched the grit of ash settle on her fingertips with a look of nauseating clarity. I don't need his apologies, she said, her voice finally carrying the weight of a woman who had reclaimed her own territory. I need his absence. A name is the most basic component of a structure, and hers had been carrying a load it was never meant to support for too long. She turned to me, the spark in her eyes catching the pale morning light. I am ready to be a Sterling again, Dad. One that isn't under surveillance. One that is real. The foundation is finally clear, Junie, I replied, feeling a sense of triumphant rebirth wash over both of us. The parasite had been deleted. As the last piece of the letter turned to gray dust and vanished into the grass, she looked at me with a definitive, honest gaze. "Now tell me everything about the night you and Mom really met," she said. I realized then that the bridge between us wasn't just repaired, it was finally built on a foundation of truth. I took a deep breath, ready to tell the story, without the shadows, knowing the load-bearing walls of our life could finally hold the weight of our history. The sunlight hit the steel cables of the Sydney Lanier Bridge with a brilliance I hadn't seen in years, casting a web of shadows across the water that felt like a map of a journey finally concluded. The smell of hickory smoke and lighter fluid was the first honest thing to fill our backyard in over a decade. 6 weeks had passed since the night at the warehouse, and the Georgia air was finally beginning to lose its heavy, humid grip. I stood by the small fire pit watching Alara and Juniper. One by one, my daughter fed the wedding album and framed photos of Garrett into the flames. She watched the glossy memories of a fabricated marriage curl into black ash with a quiet, ceremonial intensity. It was the dismantling of a structural parasite that had occupied our home for far too long. For the first time, Alara didn't watch the perimeter or scan the tree line. She only watched her daughter. "I am not burning the memories, Dad," Juniper said, her voice finally carrying a resonance I recognized. "I am burning the lies they were printed on." I nodded, reaching out to squeeze Alara's hand. The warmth of her palm was steady and real. "It is okay to let it go," Junie, Alara said softly. "There is finally room for something real. A fire is a strange thing. It can destroy a house, or it can be the only thing that keeps you warm while you build a new one." The mood shifted from the purge to the grill as I began the ritual of a standard Sunday BBQ. There were no encrypted phones on the table, no hidden surveillance, and no pretension of a perfect son-in-law. We talked about the mundane, Juniper's upcoming surgical rotation, and my new contract for a suspension bridge in Savannah. Alara sat on the patio, the orange glow of sunset on the pine trees illuminating a face that looked younger than I'd seen it in decades. She revealed then that she had officially resigned from the bureau, choosing a true retirement over the consultant life she had secretly maintained. She told the real story of how we met stripping away the librarian cover. "He spilled his coffee on my surveillance notes." She laughed, the sound of ice clinking in her tea glass like music. "I thought he was a mole trying to distract me. He was just clumsy." "I wasn't clumsy," I countered, smiling as I flipped a burger. "I was terrified of how beautiful you were." Home. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fortress. It just felt like home. Juniper sat back watching us with a peaceful clarity. She told us she had started a trust fund for Garrett's son in Ohio, choosing to break the cycle of revenge with a quiet act of grace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I watched my wife and daughter laughing together in the twilight. I thought of the suspension bridges I spend my life inspecting, how the tension is what gives them strength, provided the anchors are deep. We had found our bedrock. "We are solid, Brooks," Alara said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "No cracks." I looked at my family, realizing the structure was finally sound. I watched the last spark of the wedding album drift up into the night, a tiny orange star that eventually vanished into the real ones. And I knew that whatever bridge we built from here wouldn't just hold, it would soar. A bridge is a promise kept in steel, a silent agreement between two shores that the gap between them can finally be crossed without fear. 3 months after the warehouse raid, I sat in my engineering office, the weight of the final project ledger in my hand. Thane Garrison dropped by for one last unofficial visit, his presence no longer carrying the jagged edge of a tactical threat. "He's gone," Brooks Garrison said, his voice reflecting a quiet, bureaucratic finality. The heart just gave out in his supermax cell. No more disciples, no more sleeper agents. The architect of the covenant was dead by natural causes. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a final roar of justice, but I just felt light. The ghost who had haunted my marriage for 30 years had simply evaporated with the passage of time. Garrison mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had been providing anonymous support for Garrett's son in Ohio. Ensuring the boy's education was paid for a final act of symmetry for the child Ilara found in the rubble in 1995. I realized then that the Bureau wasn't just closing a case, they were finally healing a wound. A month later, I took Ilara and Juniper to the Sydney Lanier Bridge in Brunswick. The taste of salt air was sharp and invigorating, a clean break from the stagnant river mud of our past. We stood on the observation deck, the tactile vibration of the steel cables under my feet, feeling like a living pulse. Lies are the rust of the soul. Truth is the galvanization that makes the steel last forever. I explained the physics of the suspension system to them, using the massive cables as a metaphor for our own survival. The anchors have to be deeper than the river is dark, I said, pointing to the massive concrete foundations submerged in the churning water. That is what we did. We anchored ourselves in the truth. Juniper, now back in her surgical residency with a gaze that had finally lost its hollow monotone, looked out over the water. I am ready to stop looking over my shoulder, Dad, she admitted, her voice steady against the wind. She no longer saw a cleaning station when she looked at industrial skylines. She saw a path forward. Hold on. That was the only order I had left to follow as the family moved toward the center of the span. The hum of tires on the bridge deck was a rhythmic, peaceful drone. I looked at my wife, realized she was no longer a librarian or an agent or a ghost. She was simply Ilara. Ilara reached into her pocket and pulled out her old brass key to Unit 24. She revealed she had kept it, not for a mission, but as a memento of the day her husband became the hero she always knew I was. No more secrets, I asked, the blinding orange of the setting sun casting our long, united shadows across the asphalt. Just the ones we choose to keep for ourselves, she replied with a smile that finally reached her eyes. We were a structure that had survived a total collapse and emerged reinforced. I closed my ledger for the last time, marking the Sterling family safe for occupation. I looked out over the Atlantic, the horizon gold and limitless, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for a crack in the foundation. I was just looking at the view. Time is the only true structural sealant, filling in the cracks of a broken life, until you can finally stand on it without checking for a tremor. 2 years had passed since the night the shadows finally retreated from our lives, and the Atlantic view I had once feared to look at had become my steady horizon. I stood on the back porch of our Atlanta home, the steady weight of the porch railing beneath my hands, a grounding force in the golden hue of an autumn afternoon. Ilara was in the yard, tending to a garden she actually expected to see bloom next spring, her eyes no longer darting toward the perimeter exits. When Juniper arrived, she looked vibrant, carrying a piece that didn't feel like a mask she was forced to wear. She had spent 2 years in therapy meticulously reconstructing the trust that Garrett Kendrick had systematically dismantled. She told me she had even used Ilara's old investigative methods to perform a background check on the man she was bringing over today, but she had shared the results with him as an act of radical, uncompromised honesty. "He's almost here, Dad," she said, leaning against the post beside me. "I promise he's exactly who he says he is. I'm not worried about him, Junie," I replied, smiling as the smell of roasting corn began to drift from the grill. "I'm just happy to see you." A few minutes later, Elias Thorne, a 34-year-old history teacher with ink-stained fingers and a smile that reached his eyes, walked into our lives without a single secret to hide. He was unassuming and visibly nervous, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. Have you ever looked at a stranger and been grateful for their ordinary, boring, wonderful truth? I performed my own silent inspection, looking for the tells of a sleeper agent, but I found only the endearing sincerity of a man who truly loved my daughter. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," Elias said, shaking my hand with a grip that was honest and a bit sweaty. "Juniper has told me, well, she's told me everything. Everything is a lot of weight to carry, Elias," I said, pulling out a chair for him. "Pull up a seat." Ilara greeted him with a warmth that was no longer a tactical cover for an interrogation. Laughter, It was the only sound we hadn't had to fake in a decade. We sat at the outdoor dining table as the sun began to dip, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lawn. The conversation flowed easily. Elias talked about his students' struggle with the Civil War, and Juniper discussed her upcoming chief residency. There were no encrypted phones on the table, no undercurrent of surveillance. The Sunday BBQ was no longer a performance for a spy. It was a celebration of a family that had survived a total structural collapse. "I think the foundation is holding Alara," I whispered as I leaned toward her. "Better than holding Brooks," she replied. "It's growing." Elias then reached into his bag and revealed he had brought a gift, a collection of letters from the boy in Ohio. "He's thriving," Elias explained, handing me the tactile warmth of a fresh envelope. "He wanted you to know." As Elias handed me the first letter from the boy in Ohio, I realized that we hadn't just saved our own family. We had reached across the gap to save the next generation from the rust of the past. A perfect southern afternoon isn't about the absence of heat, but the presence of people who finally have nothing left to hide from one another. I stood by the grill, the smell of slow-roasted pork and hickory smoke drifting up into the golden Georgia evening. I watched the steam rise from the ceramic plates in my hands, feeling the tactile warmth seep into my palms. It was a weight I carried gladly. Around the table on the patio, the conversation was no longer a tactical minefield or a series of carefully constructed cover stories. Elias was asking Alara about her real childhood in Maryland, and she was answering him with a lightness I hadn't seen in decades. She didn't check her mental ledger. She didn't look at the gate. I discovered during the main course that Elias has been helping Juniper write a memoir about the woman who wasn't there, turning our shared trauma into a tool for others to find their way out of the dark. "I think these are the best ribs you've ever made," Brooks Juniper said, reaching for a side dish with hands that were steady and sure. "No structural failures in this batch." I caught her eye and smiled. "That is because I didn't have to keep one eye on the driveway this time, honey. A family is like a suspension bridge. The weight is what gives it purpose, but the truth is what keeps the cables from snapping under the strain." We discussed the latest news from Ohio as the crickets began their rising chorus in the tall grass. The boy Alara had saved, the one who could have easily been another Garrett, had just won a regional science fair. "He wants to be a structural engineer," Dad Juniper told me, her eyes bright with a legacy reclaimed. "I think it runs in the family, even the ones we choose by hand. I hope he builds things that are meant to last longer than we did," I replied, feeling the cool evening breeze against my neck. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the people who had successfully redirected a river of hate back into the sea before it could drown another generation. Nothing was hidden, not even the stars. As twilight settled and the flickering light of the patio lanterns took over, I stood back to clear the plates. I paused to look at the three people who defined my entire world. A house is just wood and stone, a skeleton of design, but a home is the integrity of the souls living inside it. I caught Alara's eye in the soft light. She leaned in and whispered that she had finally shredded the last of her Unit 24 files that morning, choosing to leave the ghost life behind without keeping a single backup. "It is a good night, Alara," I said, leaning my head against hers. "It is the best night, Brooks," she whispered back. "Because it is just a night." The work was finally done. The bridge was finished, the anchors were deep, and the road was open for miles. I looked up at the constellations beginning to pierce the Georgia sky, and realized that for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't waiting for a bridge to collapse. I was finally just enjoying the walk. I watched Alara and Juniper share a genuine, unburdened laugh, marking the definitive end of our era as ghosts. The shadows were gone, and the light was here to stay. Forgiveness isn't a moment of dramatic realization. It's a slow settling of the soil after a lifetime of tectonic shifts. I watched my family from the porch as the evening wind picked up, carrying the faint, crisp smell of pine needles in the wind. Ilara moved through the kitchen behind the screen door, her silhouette defined by a lightness she never possessed during her years as a librarian hiding a federal badge. I reflected on her decades of deception, not with the sharp, jagged edge of betrayal, but with the weary, profound understanding of a partner in survival. "You don't have to explain it anymore, Ilara?" I murmured as she stepped out to join me, the cool feel of the wooden doorframe steady beneath my hand. "I see the bridge you built. I see why you kept the cables hidden." She leaned her head against my shoulder, her breath a warm contrast to the cooling air. "I just wanted you to have a life that was yours, Brooks," she whispered. "Not theirs." I realized then that her lies weren't a lack of trust in me, but a sacrificial act of protection that I was finally ready to stop resenting. I contemplate my life's work as a bridge inspector and how it prepared me for the structural collapse of my family. I understand now that a bridge's strength doesn't come from being rigid or impenetrable, but from its ability to absorb tension and distribute weight without snapping. We were a new design forged in the fires of the warehouse and the funeral. Rust only wins if you stop looking for it, and for 30 years we had both been looking in our own ways. A bridge is just a way to beat the distance. Love is just a way to beat the dark. I realized a secret of my own in that quiet moment. I had suspected the truth of her past years ago. I had seen the inconsistencies, the way she handled a knife, the way she scanned a room, but I had chosen the lie to keep our peace. We were both architects of the same deception, building a sanctuary out of shadows. I looked up at the Georgia stars, feeling the immense scale of the world and the small, sturdy sanctuary I had reclaimed. The sound of distant, fading cicadas provided a rhythmic backdrop to my thoughts of the sun in Ohio and the legacy of truth we've left behind. Safe. The most beautiful word in the English language. It wasn't just a status on a report anymore. It was the atmosphere of my home. I walked back inside, the tactile warmth of the kitchen air wrapping around me like a blanket. Juniper looked up from the table, her eyes clear and unburdened. "Coming in, Dad?" she asked, her voice bright and genuine. I looked at my wife and my daughter, the two anchors of my existence. "I'm already home," I replied. My final structural report wasn't for a suspension span or a concrete pier. It was a personal letter I had already begun drafting to the boy in Ohio, offering him the one thing Garrett never truly had, a mentor who understands how to build things that are meant to last. I turned off the porch light with a firm click, leaving the shadows to the past, and stepped into the warm, honest glow of a house that finally had no more room for ghosts. The structure was sound. The inspection was over. I turned off the porch light, leaving the shadows to the past, and stepped into the warm, honest glow of a house that finally had no more room for ghosts. The silence of the house was complete now, a heavy, peaceful stillness that allowed me to sit in my private study and listen to the hum of the desk lamp. If you looked at the people you love right now, really looked at them, would you recognize the ghosts they're keeping at bay? It is a question that has haunted me for 30 years, and as I sit here clicking these laptop keys, I realize that structural integrity has very little to do with steel and concrete. I spent my entire career looking for hairline fractures in physical spans, while ignoring the massive fissures widening in my own living room. It is a dangerous kind of blindness, one that I have begun to document in these entries as a guide for Garrett's biological son in Ohio. I want that boy to grow up with a blueprint for integrity, a set of notes on how to spot the rust before the whole deck gives way. I used to think a bridge was safe because it looked solid, but now I know it's only safe because it's been tested by the weight of the truth. We all have a Unit 24 in our lives, a locked room where we keep our tactical secrets. The trick isn't keeping the door shut forever. It is knowing when to open it. Forgiveness isn't about the absence of pain. It's the presence of enough truth to hold the weight of the past. Are you listening? Because the crack in your own life is rarely where you are looking for it. It is often hidden behind a domestic mask or a librarian's quiet smile. I look at Ilara now, and I understand that you can't go back to the way things were before the collapse. You can only go forward to the way they are now. Her greatest mission wasn't catching a criminal or dismantled an empire. It was ensuring our family survived the wreckage of her own identity. Trust isn't the absence of secrets. It's the realization that the structure is strong enough to weather them. A story is just a bridge between two people, and I hope this one held your weight through the darkest parts of our crossing. Juniper is back in her residency, learning every day that a scalpel can heal as much as it can cut, provided the hand-holding, it is steady. I look down at the cold feel of my wedding ring, the same one I wore to a funeral that wasn't a funeral, and I acknowledge that even ghosts need a place to call home. Safe. The most beautiful word in the English language. This Project 143KV4 was never just a case file. It was my own hidden anchor. The code name itself was a secret I kept. Even when I was at my angriest, 143 for I love you and KV4 for Ilara's original agent ID. Everything is a bridge to somewhere else, and I have finally found where I'm supposed to be. I am closing the digital ledger now, the gray light of evening through the window, marking the end of my vigilance. This is Brooks Sterling. Inspection complete. I close the laptop, the screen going black, and reflecting my face not as a widower and not as a victim, but as a man who finally knew the difference between a secret and a sanctuary. I close the laptop, the screen going black, and reflecting my face not as a widower and not as a victim, but as a man who finally knew the difference between a secret and a sanctuary. A story doesn't really end when the last word is spoken. It ends when the listener finally feels safe enough to stand up and walk back into their own life. I felt the tactile smoothness of the door handle as I stepped out of the study, leaving the digital ledger behind for the last time. The warmth of the living room light spilled into the hallway, a soft amber glow that felt like a physical embrace. I entered the kitchen to find Ilara pouring 2 glasses of wine, the melodic sound of the liquid hitting the glass, a gentle punctuation to the evening's quiet. She caught my eye and gave me a subtle, knowing wink. It was a gesture she used to use when we had successfully navigated a boring PTA meeting or a long flight. But I realized then it was more. That wink was a signal in a code we had created 30 years ago, a silent transmission that meant I am finally safe. It was the final confirmation that the agent and the librarian had merged into a woman who was simply and wonderfully my wife. "You look like a man who just finished a very long walk," she said, handing me a glass. I took a sip, the weight of the day finally lifting. "I think I'm finally home, Ilara." Juniper joined us a moment later, the smell of night jasmine clinging to her as she stepped in from the porch. She showed us a photo on her phone of a new bridge design she'd been studying in a medical journal, an article about civil engineering's impact on hospital accessibility. "I want to see the Savannah project, Dad." She set her eyes bright with a curiosity that didn't have a double meaning. "I want to see how you anchor something that big. We will go together," I promised. "All of us. So what are you waiting for?" The light is on, and the road is clear. The conversation turned to the future vacations that didn't involve safe houses and Sundays that didn't require surveillance. For the first time, we weren't looking for a way out. We were looking at the way in. A beginning is just an ending that decided to keep going. I stepped out onto the porch one last time, listening to the steady, rhythmic chirping of crickets. The bridge is open. Now it's your turn to cross. Check your own anchors. Look for the rust in your own foundations and never be afraid of the truth that sets the steel. Good night. I looked back at the house, seeing a small, handwritten sign Juniper had tucked into the corner of the porch railing that afternoon, Sterling and Company, inspection complete. It was a new family business of honesty, a blueprint for a life built to last. The screen of my mind faded to black as the laughter of my wife and daughter drifted through the open window, a sound so pure it needed no encryption. The last thing I saw wasn't a secret. It's the clear, honest reflection of a man who finally has nothing to hide. This concludes the journey. The structure is sound. When I look back at everything that happened, I realize this was never just a dramatic family story about crime, betrayal, or survival. It was also a painful mirror showing me my own blind spots. For decades, I believed that providing stability and protection was enough to keep my family safe. But the truth is, a man can inspect bridges his entire life and still miss the cracks forming inside his own home. That is the hardest lesson this family story taught me. Some people online might call what happened a form of dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. My dad revenge was never about destroying Garrett or proving I was right. It was about protecting my daughter and breaking a cycle of hatred that had lasted for decades. In the end, the real victory was not revenge. It was choosing truth over secrets and choosing healing over anger. That is why this family story changed me forever. If there is one thing I want you to learn from my mistakes, it is this: do not ignore the quiet warnings in your life the way I once did. Pride, silence, and comfortable lies can slowly weaken the strongest families. My version of dad revenge taught me that love must be protected with honesty, not control. And through all of this, I believe God allowed the darkness to surface so that the truth could finally set our family free. This dad revenge story is not about punishment. It is about redemption. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Brooke Sterling's position, facing the truth about someone you trusted most? I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this family story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. A gentle note: although this narrative draws inspiration from complex family conflicts and social realities, some elements have been dramatized to enhance the storytelling experience. If this type of content isn't your preference, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.